The sound of thundering hooves fills the air, a horde of fierce warriors, their long braids whipping in the wind, charge across the endless grasslands. But wait, are we in the steppes of Central Asia or the fictional world of Westeros? Hey there, history buffs and Game of Thrones fanatics. Today, we're embarking on an epic journey that bridges the gap between real-world history and one of the most iconic fantasy series ever created. We're diving deep into the question, were the Mongols the real-life inspiration for George R.R. Martin's fierce Dothraki warriors in Game of Thrones? Stick around, and you might just see Game of Thrones and history in a whole new light. But before we charge headlong into battle, let's set the stage. George R.R. Martin, the mastermind behind A Song of Ice and Fire, is renowned for weaving real historical events and cultures into his fantasy tapestry. The Red Wedding, inspired by the Black Dinner of 1440 in Scotland. The Wall, think Hadrian's Wall, but with a magical twist. But when it comes to the Dothraki, George R.R. Martin seems to have looked east, way east, to the steppes of Central Asia and the legendary Mongol Empire. And boy, did he strike gold. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. But wait, the Mongols weren't just mindless savages. And you're absolutely right. The real Mongols were far more complex than their pop culture image suggests. They were master strategists, skilled administrators, and even pioneers of global trade. But for now, let's focus on the aspects that seem to have inspired Martin's Dothraki. First up, let's talk about life on the move. Both the Mongols and the Dothraki were nomadic people, and this lifestyle shaped everything about their cultures. The Mongols roamed the vast grasslands of the Eurasian steppe, a sea of grass that stretched from Eastern Europe to Manchuria. This harsh, unforgiving landscape forged them into the tough, resourceful people they became. Now, does this sound familiar? It should, because the Dothraki have their own sea. The Dothraki Sea, a massive grassland in Essos that's practically a character in its own right. For both cultures, horses weren't just animals, they were life itself. The Mongols had a saying, "A Mongol without a horse is like a bird without wings." The Dothraki take this even further. Remember Drogo's line? "A man who doesn't ride is no man at all." Here's a mind-blowing fact. At the height of the Mongol Empire, it's estimated there were 5 horses for every human in Mongolia. The Dothraki might even surpass that. In the books, their horses are described as seeming beyond count. Both cultures started training their children to ride almost as soon as they could walk. Mongol kids would be lashed to their horses to learn balance, a practice mirrored almost exactly by the Dothraki. Talk about extreme parenting. Now let's talk homes, or rather, the lack of them. Both the Mongols and Dothraki shared a distaste for permanent structures. The Mongols lived in jairs, or yurts, brilliant portable dwellings that could be assembled or disassembled in about an hour. The Dothraki, in true Martin style, have a more extreme version. They actively loathe permanent buildings. Their only city, Vaes Dothrak, is famously filled with stolen monuments, but no Dothraki-built structures. It's like they took the Mongol preference for mobility and turned it into a religious conviction. Now, let's get to the good stuff. The warrior culture that made both these groups the terror of their known worlds. The Mongols were arguably the most successful conquerors in history, creating the largest contiguous land empire ever seen. At its peak, it stretched from Korea to Hungary. That's like ruling from New York to Los Angeles, twice over. Their military prowess was legendary, combining masterful horsemanship with deadly archery skills. A Mongol warrior could shoot an arrow accurately while riding at full gallop, a feat that would make even Legolas jealous. Now, look at the Dothraki. Martin took this historical badassery and dialed it up to 11. Like the Mongols, the Dothraki are unparalleled mounted archers. But Martin adds his own twist. The Arak, that wicked curved blade that's part scimitar, part scythe. Both cultures shared a disdain for infantry combat and siege warfare. The Mongols eventually adapted, learning to conquer cities. The Dothraki, they stayed true to their roots. As Jorah Mormont says, the Dothraki have never been defeated in battle. Well, neither had the Mongols, until they started fighting in places where their horses weren't so effective. But it's not just about fighting style. Both cultures glorified warfare and conquest. For a Mongol or a Dothraki, being a great warrior was the highest aspiration. Victory meant everything, and defeat was catastrophic. Here's a chilling parallel. Both groups were known to use psychological warfare, piling up the skulls of their enemies. The Mongols did this at Baghdad in 1258. The Dothraki have their horse gate in Vaes Dothrak, lined with the stolen gods of conquered peoples. Martin took a historical terror tactic and gave it a uniquely Dothraki spin. Now let's talk looks. While the Dothraki's appearance is more exaggerated for dramatic effect, there are some interesting parallels with the Mongols. Both groups favored long hair for men, often in braids. For the Dothraki, these braids were badges of honor, cut only upon defeat. While historical Mongols didn't share this exact custom, long hair was indeed common among men. Genghis Khan himself was described as having long, flowing hair in his youth. In terms of clothing, both favored practical, riding-friendly attire. Leather played a big role, as did clothes made from materials readily available on the steppes. Here's an interesting tidbit. Mongol warriors often wore silk undershirts. Why? Because if an arrow penetrated their armor, the silk wouldn't break. Instead, it would wrap around the arrowhead, making it easier to remove the arrow and preventing infection. Now that's some 13th century high-tech. When it comes to leadership and social structure, the parallels get even more fascinating. The Mongol Empire was led by a great Khan, with lesser Khans leading various tribes or hordes. This hierarchy is mirrored almost exactly in Dothraki society, with its numerous Khaleesars led by individual Khals, and the concept of a single, supreme Khal uniting all Dothraki. But here's where Martin adds his own spice. In Mongol society, the title of Great Khan was hereditary, passed down through Genghis Khan's bloodline. The Dothraki, in contrast, follow strength. Any Khal can potentially become the leader of all Dothraki, if he's strong enough. Both societies were deeply patriarchal, with men, particularly warriors, holding the most power. However, it's worth noting that both cultures did have some powerful women. In Mongol history, we have figures like Khutulun, the undefeated wrestling princess, and Borte, Genghis Khan's chief wife and trusted advisor. Martin mirrors this with characters like the Dashkaleen, the widows of dead Khals who wield significant spiritual and political influence. And of course, there's Daenerys Targaryen, who becomes a Dothraki Khaleesi and eventually commands her own Khalasar. Finally, let's delve into the spiritual side of things. Here, Martin seems to have taken some creative liberties, but there are still fascinating connections. The Mongols practiced a form of shamanic religion, believing in the eternal blue sky and the power of nature spirits. They were famously tolerant of other religions, with Genghis Khan himself hedging his bets by praying to all gods before battle. While the Dothraki religion isn't explored in depth, we do see nature worship elements, particularly in their reverence for the stars and the great stallion deity. Martin seems to have taken the Mongol spiritual connection to nature and focused it through a horse-centric lens. Both cultures also had elaborate funeral customs for their leaders. Mongol Khans were often buried in secret locations, with horses sacrificed to serve them in the afterlife. The Dothraki similarly burned their fallen Khals, along with their possessions, including horses. One of the most memorable Dothraki customs from the show is the heart-eating ritual performed by Khaleesi Daenerys. While there's no direct Mongol parallel for this, the Mongols did have various rituals involving animal parts. For instance, they would sometimes drink blood mixed with milk as a show of brotherhood. Martin took these real practices and cranked up the drama for his fantasy world. The parallels between the Mongols and the Dothraki are striking, from their nomadic lifestyle and warrior ethos to their social structures and spiritual beliefs. Martin's creation, while fictional, offers a fascinating glimpse into the realities of historical nomadic empires. But here's the thing, Martin didn't just copy and paste the Mongols into his world. He took inspiration from their history, their legends, and even the myths about them, then let his imagination run wild. The result is a culture that feels both familiar and fantastical, the perfect blend for his epic saga. So, the next time you're watching Khal Drogo lead his Khalasar across the Dothraki Sea, take a moment to appreciate the echoes of real history thundering beneath those horse hooves. Martin's genius lies not just in his imagination, but in his ability to weave real-world inspirations into a tapestry that feels entirely new. Now, I'm curious, what other historical parallels have you spotted in Game of Thrones? The Valyrians and the Roman Empire? The Ironborns? Drop your theories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the historical roots of Westeros, why not hit that subscribe button? We'll be exploring more fascinating connections between history and pop culture in future videos. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.